Have you ever noticed that the men the world remembers were never forged in comfort? That the ones who built empires, commanded rooms, and moved through life like forces of nature were not born that way? They were crushed, pressured, broken down to their most essential elements, and then rebuilt into something the world wasn't ready for. The diamond doesn't apologize for being born in darkness under unimaginable pressure. It simply becomes what it was always meant to be. And right now, whether you realize it or not, your darkest moments are doing exactly the same thing to you. They are not punishing you, they are forging you. Montaigne, the philosopher who watched kings rise and crumble, observed something that most men miss entirely. The individuals who eventually mastered life weren't those who avoided pain. They were the ones who stopped running from it. They sat down in the fire, breathed through the burn, and emerged from the other side not just intact, but transformed. Something fundamental changed in their structure. Something shifted at the core that no amount of motivation, affirmation, or comfortable living could ever produce. Pressure created what peace never could. This is not a comfortable video. This is not a pep talk. I'm not here to tell you that everything happens for a reason or that the universe has a beautiful plan. I'm here to tell you the cold, brutal, and ultimately liberating truth. Your anxiety, your pressure, your crisis, they are materials. Raw materials. The question is whether you know what to build with them, whether you're going to let the pressure crush you into dust or compress you into something unbreakable. By the end of this, you will understand not just why you suffer, but what that suffering is actually producing inside you, if you choose to use it correctly. So stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you changes everything. Part 1. The lie they sold you. From the moment you were old enough to understand language, they sold you a vision of the good life. A smooth ride, a gentle arc upward, where hard work quietly rewards itself, where nice men finish well, where patience is met with abundance. They showed you the house, the car, the smiling family, the career that unfolds like a carpet laid before royalty. They told you the path was clear, the obstacles were temporary, and comfort was the destination. They lied to you, not because they were malicious, though some were, but because they themselves believed. Idri, generation after generation, passing down the same beautiful, dangerous fantasy, that a good man in a good world suffers only moderately and then rests. That anxiety is a malfunction. That pressure is an enemy to be medicated, managed, minimized. That the goal of existence is to arrive somewhere soft and stay there. And because you believed it, every time pressure arrived, every financial collapse, every betrayal, every season where the walls closed in, you interpreted it as evidence that you had failed, that you had taken a wrong turn, that the universe had misidentified you. You asked, why me? What did I do wrong? When does this end? But here is what Machiavelli understood, that the comfortable world refuses to teach. The question is never why me. The question is always what for. History doesn't record the men who lived without friction. It records the ones who were put through the fire and decided to stay standing. Musashi, who fought and won 60 duels without a single defeat, didn't develop his philosophy in a dojo surrounded by comfort. He developed it wandering alone, sleeping on cold ground, living at the absolute edge of survival. Every night that could have killed him made him sharper. Every betrayal by the world made his mind clearer. Every season of want made his will harder. The lie they sold you was that pressure is a problem. The truth Musashi lived was that pressure is a process. A sacred, brutal, indispensable process, and the men who understand this walk through the world differently than everyone else. They stop reacting to difficulty and start reading it. They stop asking when it ends and start asking what it's building. That shift from victim to builder is the first move toward the unbreakable mind. Part 2. The science of the forge. Let's get specific. Let's talk about what actually happens inside you when pressure arrives, because this isn't just philosophy. This is biology, psychology, and architecture of identity operating. Simultaneously, when a bone is subjected to repeated stress, something counterintuitive happens. The stress creates microscopic fractures in the bone structure. The body detects these fractures, sends resources to repair them, and the repaired bone is denser and stronger than the original. This is the basis of all physical training. You don't build strength by avoiding load. You build it by repeatedly applying controlled stress and then recovering. Your mind and your character work identically. Every financial crisis you've navigated, even the ones that left marks, deposited something into you that no amount of reading about money could produce. Real pattern recognition, real risk calibration, real understanding of what collapse feels like and how to survive it. Men who've never been truly broke can theorize about financial pressure. Men who've been through it know things at a cellular level that theory can't touch. Every relationship that crushed you deposited something. 2. The betrayal that left you staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m., unable to breathe. It peeled away illusions you were carrying that would have cost you far more later. It showed you how people operate under pressure, under temptation, when the stakes shift. It showed you your own patterns, your own blind spots, your own places of neediness that made you vulnerable. That knowledge, as brutal as it was delivered, is now armor. Montaigne observed this in his own life after surviving political upheaval, near-death illness, and the collapse of everything he had built. He wrote, "I study myself more than any other subject. It is my metaphysics. It is my physics." The pressure didn't defeat him. It gave him material to work with. It forced the kind of self-examination that comfortable men never do, because comfortable men never need to. The forge works like this. Pressure applied to a defined purpose produces transformation. Pressure applied without purpose, without a frame, without a question being asked of the difficulty, produces only damage. This is the difference between the man who comes out of crisis wiser and the man who comes out bitter, closed, destroyed. The variable is not the pressure, the variable is the orientation of the mind during the pressure. Part 3. Anxiety as intelligence. Now let's talk about anxiety specifically, because this is where most men are getting it exactly wrong. You've been taught that anxiety is a malfunction, a signal that something is broken in you, a disorder to be corrected, a weakness to be ashamed of. The therapy industry tells you to manage it. The pharmaceutical industry tells you to medicate it. Society tells you to hide it behind performance, behind humor, behind the carefully constructed image of a man who has it together. But what if anxiety is not a malfunction? What if it's actually one of the most sophisticated pieces of intelligence a human being possesses? Consider what anxiety actually is at its core. It is your system's acute awareness that something important is at stake, combined with an elevated state of preparation to respond. Every muscle in your body primed, every sense sharpened, every non-essential process deprioritized. Your ancestors who experienced no anxiety in the face of threat did not survive to pass on genes. The ones who felt the sharp edge of alarm and responded to it, they persisted. Anxiety is not the problem. Anxiety is the signal. The samurai understood this. Musashi did not. Write about eliminating the feeling of danger before a duel. He wrote about learning to perceive it clearly without being controlled by it. There is a crucial distinction there that most men never grasp, between being informed by anxiety and being governed by it, between receiving the signal and drowning in the noise. The man who is governed by his anxiety reacts, he contracts, he avoids, he over-explains, overthinks, over-prepares for every catastrophic scenario, while the actual moment slips past him unaddressed. His anxiety, which was intelligence, has become prison. the man who receives his anxiety as information, who trains himself to ask, "What is this alerting me to? What does this heightened state have to tell me?" That man has converted one of the most powerful signals in human biology into strategic data. He uses the electricity of anxiety the way a fighter uses adrenaline, not to flee, but to perform at levels unavailable to those who feel nothing. Here is the practical. Reframe. Next time anxiety rises in you, instead of immediately working to suppress it, pause. Breathe. Ask it one question. What are you telling me is important here? The answer to that question will frequently reveal something you've been avoiding seeing, a conversation you've been postponing, a decision you've been softening, a reality you've been negotiating with instead of facing directly. Anxiety is the compass of the serious man. It points always at what matters most. Part 4. The 3 pressures that forge kings. Not all pressure works the same way. After watching men emerge from crisis transformed and watching others emerge destroyed, certain patterns become visible. There are 3 types of pressure that, when understood, stop being threats and become instruments. The first is the pressure of scarcity, when the money runs out, when the opportunity collapses, when resources are stripped and you are left with only what you actually are, without the buffer of abundance. Most men experience this as pure catastrophe, and it is, on the surface. But underneath the catastrophe, something else is happening. Every unnecessary thing you were carrying is being stripped away. Every false identity propped up by possessions and status is being revealed as what it always was, a costume. The man who survives real scarcity without losing his center discovers something permanent about himself. He discovers that he is not his bank account. He is not his address. He is not his job title or his car or the opinion of his social circle. He is something more fundamental, a mind, a character, a pattern of decision-making under pressure. And that discovery is irreversible. Nobody can take it from him because it was never located outside him to begin with. Machiavelli watched princes lose their kingdoms and rebuild them. He observed that the ones who rebuilt were not necessarily the most talented or the most gifted. They were the ones who knew who they were when everything external was stripped away. Scarcity, applied with endurance, forges identity at the foundation rather than the surface. The second is the pressure of betrayal. This one cuts deeper because it comes from inside the perimeter. The friend who turns, the partner who reveals a different character under pressure, the ally who quietly positions themselves to benefit from your collapse. This kind of pressure is designed, in its cruelty, to destroy your capacity for trust. And many men let it do. Exactly that, emerging closed, armored against connection, bitter at their core. But betrayal, received correctly, does something else. It is the most efficient education in human nature you can receive. It forces you, in a way that no book or lecture ever could, to understand how people actually operate beneath their stated values, how incentives shift behavior, how loyalty is conditional by nature, how the man who expects unconditional loyalty from conditional human beings is building on sand. Musashi expected betrayal the way a general expects changing weather. He planned for it, not with bitterness but with strategic realism. He formed alliances knowing their limits. He trusted while verifying. He gave people access to him in proportion to their demonstrated character rather than their stated intentions. This is not cynicism. This is precision, and it only becomes available to the man who has been burned enough to understand the difference. The third is the pressure of isolation, the seasons when the path is yours alone, when the people around you cannot follow where you're going, either because they don't understand it or because they've chosen not to. When you are building in silence, advancing without audience, enduring without witness. This is often the hardest pressure for men who were taught that success should be recognized, that effort should be appreciated, that progress should be visible to the people around them. Isolation, voluntarily endured, produces something rare, the ability to be your own source, the ability to generate motivation, direction, and standards internally rather than requiring them to arrive from outside. The man who can operate in silence without losing his north is the man who cannot be controlled by social pressure, by the approval or disapproval of his circle, by the opinions of those who will never take the risks he is taking. Montaigne went into deliberate isolation to write his essays, not because he disliked people, but because he understood that the deepest thinking requires a silence that crowds destroy. In that isolation, he produced work that is still read 5 centuries later. The pressure of being alone with his own thoughts, without the noise of social performance and external validation, forced him to develop resources that external life never could have produced. Part 5. The mental architecture of the unbreakable. Understanding that pressure is a forge is one thing. Actually, building yourself into something unbreakable inside, it is another. Let's talk about architecture, specifically the mental structures that allow a man to receive maximum pressure and emerge stronger rather than destroyed. The first structure is what I'll call the observer throne. Inside the crucible of pressure, most men become what is happening to them. The crisis absorbs them. Their identity merges with the difficulty until they cannot see past it. This is the state in which irrational decisions are made. Permanent conclusions are drawn from temporary conditions, and the future is mortgaged to pay for the emotional demands of the present. The observer throne is the ability to watch yourself inside the crisis without being consumed by it. To notice, I'm experiencing severe financial pressure rather than I am a failure. To notice, I'm feeling overwhelming anxiety right now rather than I am an anxious person. The distinction sounds subtle. The practical consequences are enormous. Musashi wrote about this when he described the ability to see distant things as if they were close and close things as if they were distant. It is a form of perceptual flexibility, the ability to zoom in on the detail when precision is required and zoom out to the long view when perspective is required. This doesn't happen automatically. It is a trained capacity built through repeated practice in lower stakes moments, so it's available in the highest stakes ones. The practice, in any moment of elevated pressure, pause long enough to write a single sentence that describes what you are observing, not what you are feeling. My cash flow is negative by X amount this month. Not, I'm drowning and I don't know how to survive. One is information. The other is emotion consuming itself. The observer throne gives you access to the information while metabolizing the emotion rather than being metabolized by it. The second structure is intentional reframing. The meaning you assign to pressure determines what it does to you. This is not positive thinking. This is not telling yourself a comfortable story. This is something more demanding. Deliberately interrogating the story you're already telling yourself and determining whether it serves your survival and advancement. When a man tells himself, "This is destroying me," the story produces one set of physiological and behavioral responses: contraction, despair, disengagement, surrender. When a man tells himself, "This is testing the limit of what I can handle, and I intend to find that limit," an entirely different set of responses is produced: engagement, problem-solving, endurance, adaptation. The pressure is identical. The meaning creates completely different outcomes. Machiavelli was a master of this reframe in practice. When he was imprisoned, tortured, and exiled from the Florentine political life he had dedicated himself to, he did not interpret this as the end of his significance. He interpreted it as forced time for the most important project of his life. He wrote The Prince in Exile. The most influential political text in Western history was produced by a man most of the world had decided was finished. His reframe was not optimistic fantasy. It was strategic orientation toward what was actually possible rather than grief for what had been lost. The third structure is forward horizon anchoring. Pressure contracts the time horizon. When you are inside difficulty, the immediate overwhelms the long term. The next bill, the next confrontation, the next failure, they fill the entire screen. The future, which is where your actual life is still being built, becomes invisible. Forward horizon. Anchoring is the deliberate practice of keeping one fixed point on the horizon visible, even when the immediate surroundings are chaos. Not a fantasy. A specific, concrete, real thing you are building toward that has meaning beyond the current crisis. A body of work, a version of yourself, a standard of living you're constructing, a legacy that will exist after the present pressure has been forgotten. Musashi, wandering without wealth or political position for years, was anchored to the mastery of strategy and the completion of the Book of Five Rings. That anchor allowed him to endure conditions that would have broken men who had nothing forward to orient themselves toward. It is not the comfortable man with the clear path who achieves the extraordinary. It is the man with the horizon locked in his sights, advancing through obstruction because the anchor is pulling him forward regardless of what surrounds him. Part 6. The Alchemy of Crisis. Let's go deeper. Because there is a level of transformation available inside genuine crisis that nothing else in life produces. And most men never access it because they spend their energy trying to end the crisis rather than extracting what the crisis uniquely offers. Alchemy is the ancient idea of transforming base material into gold. The metaphor is apt. Inside every genuine crisis, financial collapse, health emergency, relationship devastation, career destruction, there are base materials that, processed correctly, become more valuable than gold. Specifically, clarity, humility, priority, and presence. Clarity is what burns away in fire. When pressure strips away the inessential, what remains is what actually matters to you. The crisis has a way of organizing a man's values with a brutality that years of comfortable reflection never could. You discover what you would not trade. You discover what you were carrying that was never actually yours. You discover which relationships held underweight and which dissolved. That information is irreplaceable. The man who survives genuine crisis with his eyes open knows his priorities in a way that no questionnaire or vision board could ever produce. Humility arrives with the fall, and genuine humility, not the performed self-deprecation of insecure men, but the actual recognition of the limits of your own knowledge, control, and power, is one of the most strategically valuable things a man can possess. Machiavelli, despite his reputation as the architect of cynical power, was deeply humble about the unpredictability of fortune. He knew that the best strategy could be undone by circumstances beyond any individual's control. That knowledge made him more flexible, more adaptive, and more durable than the men who believed they could dominate outcomes through will alone. Humility, forced by crisis, is a gift, because it makes you accurate rather than arrogant in your assessment of reality. Priority, the knowledge of what to put your energy into first, becomes crystalline under genuine pressure. When resources are scarce and time is short, and only the essential can be tended, you discover what is essential. And that discovery typically reveals that you were spending enormous energy on things that were peripheral, performative, or purely habitual. The crisis reorganizes you. If you let it, if you observe the reorganization rather than resisting it, you emerge from it with a clarity of focus that transforms your rate of advancement. Men who've been through real pressure often remark that they accomplish more after the crisis with less than they accomplished before it with plenty. The pressure taught them what actually moves the needle. And presence, the capacity to be fully inside the moment rather than split between past regret and future anxiety. This is perhaps the most precious gift of genuine difficulty. There is a strange peace available inside maximum pressure when you have accepted the present circumstances completely, when you have stopped dividing your energy between fighting what is and building from what is. Musashi described a state of mind in combat where past and future collapsed and only the present action remained. That state, which warriors train for years to access, is sometimes forced open by genuine crisis. The man who walks out of crisis, having touched that state once, having felt what it is to be fully present because the present demanded everything, that man has access to something that changes the quality of everything he does afterward. Part 7. Building while burning. The most counterintuitive truth about pressure is this: the time to build is not after the crisis ends. The time to build is inside it. This seems paradoxical. How do you build when you're on fire? But consider what the men who emerge, transformed from pressure, share in common. They did not go dormant and wait. They did not pause their development until conditions improved. They built inside the difficulty, often with the limited resources available, in ways shaped by the constraints of the crisis itself. Musashi developed his two-sword fighting style, not in a comfortable dojo, but in the middle of actual combat, adapting under life or death conditions in real time. The technique was born from the pressure. It would not have existed without the battle that required it. The man who loses his primary income and, while managing the fear and shame and practical crisis that involves, quietly develops a secondary skill. That man is being forged by the pressure into something the comfortable version of himself never would have built. The man who goes through devastating relationship loss and, while processing the grief, sits with himself long enough to understand his own patterns with a honesty he'd previously avoided. That man is being reshaped by the pressure into someone capable of relationships the previous version never could have sustained. Building while burning requires one thing above all else: the refusal to go passive, the refusal to tell yourself that this is not the time, that you'll begin again when conditions improve, that survival consumes everything and nothing can be built in survival mode. That is a lie your fear tells you. It is not what the evidence of great lives shows. What the evidence shows is that the forge is active, that the transformation is happening inside the fire, not after it, and the man who engages with what the pressure is producing, who asks daily, "What is this building in me? What am I learning? What is being stripped away that needed to go? What is being hardened that needed to be harder?" That man controls the output of the forge rather than simply enduring it. The journal is a tool here, not the therapeutic journal of processing emotions, though that has its place. The strategic journal. What did this pressure reveal today? What decision did it force that I'd been avoiding? What capacity did it require that I didn't know I had? Tracking the forge's output keeps you oriented as a builder rather than a victim. It gives you evidence, accumulating daily, that something is being produced, and that evidence becomes fuel. Part 8. The man who arrives. There comes a moment, and the men who've been through it know exactly what I'm describing, when you look at yourself inside a season of difficulty and something has shifted. You are not what you were when the pressure began. Something has closed off that used to be exposed. Something has opened that used to be locked. You move differently. You respond differently. The things that would have paralyzed the earlier version of you pass through you now with a different quality. They still land, they still register, but they no longer stop you. They are information now, rather than obstruction. This is not callousness. This is not the closing off of a man who has been hurt too many times to feel. This is something closer to the opposite, the opening of a man who has been through enough to know that he can receive difficulty without being defined by it. Montaigne described it as a kind of ease, not the ease of a man to whom nothing difficult happens, but the ease of a man who has stopped being surprised by difficulty and has developed a reliable relationship with his own capacity to navigate it. The man who arrives from the forge is recognizable, not because he announces his transformation, he doesn't. Not because he performs strength. That's the behavior of men who haven't done the work. He's recognizable because of what's absent. The anxiety of the man who hasn't yet discovered he can survive becomes, in the man who has, a quiet confidence that doesn't require display. The need for external validation that characterized the earlier version becomes an internal calibration that doesn't depend on what others reflect back. The reactivity that came from having never tested his own limits becomes a stillness that comes from having tested them and not broken. This is the man that Machiavelli would look at and recognize. Not the man with the most resources or the most comfort, the man with the most durable center, the man whose identity doesn't live in his circumstances because circumstances have repeatedly demonstrated their unreliability. The man who has been separated from everything external and found that the essential thing remained. He's not bulletproof. That's a fantasy. He still feels. He still fails. He still encounters seasons of pressure that bring him to the edge, but the edge no longer means the same thing to him. He's been to the edge before. He knows what's there, and he knows what he found there, not destruction, but the next version of himself waiting to be forged. Part 9. The choice that separates. We arrive finally at the only thing that actually matters in everything I've told you, because the forging is not automatic. The pressure does not automatically produce kings. It produces very different outcomes depending on a single variable, a choice that every man inside pressure faces and that most men make by default rather than by intention. The choice is this: do you define yourself by the fire, or are you defined by what the fire reveals? The man who defines himself by the fire says, "This is what happened to me. This is the damage. This is the deficit. This is the evidence that the world is hostile, that my timing was wrong, that luck was against me, that I am owed something by circumstances that instead took from me." He carries the pressure as an identity. He introduces himself with his losses. He explains himself through his wounds. The fire becomes his story rather than his process, and he remains inside it permanently long after the external crisis has ended. The man defined by what the fire reveals says, "This is what I discovered I was made of when the conditions removed every comfortable alternative. This is what was underneath when everything surface was stripped away. This is the shape of my actual character, not the character I performed in easy circumstances, but the one that held under maximum load." He carries the pressure as evidence of something about himself that he now knows permanently. The fire is not his identity. It was his examination, and he passed. The difference between these two men is not intelligence. It is not talent. It is not the severity of the pressure they faced. Often the man defined by the fire endured objectively less than the man defined by what the fire revealed. The difference is orientation. Specifically, whether the lens points outward at what the world did to him or inward at what the world, in doing that, forced him to become. This is the final and most essential reframe. Not what is this pressure doing to me, but what is this pressure making of me? Because pressure doesn't care what you were before it arrived. It doesn't honor your past comfort or your previous achievements or the life you had planned. It applies itself to what is actually there and compresses it. And the outcome, always in every case without exception, is determined by the quality of what is actually there when the pressure arrives, and the intention with which that material meets the forge. So here is where I leave you, not with comfort, not with a plan, not with a guarantee that the pressure will ease, or that the anxiety will resolve, or that the crisis is nearly over. It may not be. There may be more ahead. The forge doesn't schedule itself around your preferences. But with this, the next time pressure arrives, and it will arrive, you have a choice about what it means. You have a choice about what it is building. You have a choice about the question you ask of it, and therefore the answer it produces inside you. The men who moved. History were not men who escaped the fire. They were men who stayed in it long enough to be transformed by it, who kept their eyes open during the burning, who came out the other side carrying what they discovered in the heat, that they were harder than they knew, deeper than they'd been tested, more capable of endurance than any comfortable life would have required them to be. That is what your darkest moments are doing, if you let them. Not punishing you, not defining your limits, revealing your resources, compressing you into the shape that your highest version requires. The forge is active. You are inside it. Choose to be built. Comment below. The fire does not consume me. It completes me. Not for the algorithm, as a pact with the part of yourself that has already decided to survive this and come out unrecognizable to who you were before it began. The transformation doesn't happen after you leave the fire. It happens because you chose to stay.